What's up everybody, this is Master Ian Gamer. While the Overwatch 2 PvP livestream may not have contained any official new hero reveals, there were still some suspicious little clues and details present on the maps shown, which upon further analysis may in fact be teasing a future Overwatch 2 hero. So today I'll be delving into the mysterious character known as Zephyrus, whose name appears on multiple maps and upon further examination turns out to be a lot more interesting than I'd initially thought. Real quick before we get into it though, I'd like to remind you to subscribe and hit up that bell icon if you haven't already to never miss out on any future Overwatch and Overwatch 2 news and content. But now let's take a deep dive into Zephyrus, the very bizarre Greek gladiator. So first and foremost, let's take a look at the most notable appearance of Zephyrus during the PvP stream, which is in this poster seen scattered across the new Rome map. The poster itself is advertising a gladiator battle between Zephyrus and Maximus, which we can assume is taking place within the Roman Colosseum. However, an interesting detail to take note of is that above and below the two armored fighters, we can see what appear to be two people in some kind of thin sci-fi outfits. While we can't say for sure just yet what kind of suits these are, my guess is that they are in fact some kind of VR motion tracking suits, as indicated by the large visually impairing helmets and handheld controllers. If this is the case, then we can reasonably assume that the two people seen at the edges of the poster are in fact controlling the gladiator fighters in the middle via the suits and their own physical motions. Now, beyond this being a cool sci-fi twist on Roman gladiator battles, it also raises further questions regarding the logistics of the fight itself. Are the gladiator robots actually massive, with the pilots being situated inside them like the Sviatogor mechs seen in Volskaya Industries? Or perhaps the robots are themselves more human-sized, with the pilots controlling them externally from the battle arena sidelines? Or perhaps the robots don't even exist at all, and instead are just digital avatars who fight in an entirely virtual arena that is then broadcast on screens within the Colosseum like some kind of advanced esport. It's impossible to say which of these is the case based on just the limited details we have, but I'll be coming back to examine these possibilities in a bit more depth later on in this video. Another point of interest regarding this poster is that despite being present in multiple spots on the map, it actually appears to be a recent addition. Looking back at Rome's initial reveal during BlizzConline, we never got a clear shot of any of the locations where these posters are located. However, we do get this one partial view of where one of the posters should be. It's hard to tell what exactly the poster seen here is showing. To me, it looks very similar to some of the posters seen on Numbani, but regardless, it's most definitely not the poster we saw during the PvP livestream. I did my best to find a matching camera angle from the PvP stream to what we saw at BlizzConline, and this was the closest I could manage. It's not the exact same angle, but it's close enough to verify that both posters are in the same position, and that the poster present during BlizzConline was definitely not the same one seen during the PvP stream. This may or may not mean anything, but it does confirm that Blizzard intentionally added this poster to Rome after having already shown the map off back at BlizzConline. Now, while this poster of Zephyrus versus Maximus is certainly interesting, on its own it doesn't necessarily stand out as being anything to get overly hyped about. After all, there are countless non-playable characters shown off on different Overwatch maps, so the presence of two more is nothing special. Even with the poster being retroactively added to the map following BlizzConline, you could write that off as Blizzard just iterating on the map's art and detailing prior to its release. But what it doesn't account for is Blizzard themselves going out of their way to draw people's attention to these two gladiators in particular. During the Overwatch 2 PvP livestream, Overwatch's social media accounts were periodically making posts for the new maps and content shown as it aired. For the new maps shown off, each post featured a short video clip and some notable landmarks or points of interest from those maps. And on the post for Rome, one of the three things highlighted was the battle between Zephyrus and Maximus. Now, something else which stuck out to me is the redundancy of listing both the Colosseum and the Gladiator battle as separate points of interest. Presumably, the battle is taking place within the Colosseum, as indicated by the placement of the posters on the map itself, so why list the building and the building's event as separate points of interest? Out of all the things they could have pointed out, it wasn't the beautiful vista, or the historical architecture, or the various food trucks and shops scattered about, or even just a generic acknowledgement of gladiatorial combat. It was specifically Zephyrus versus Maximus. It almost seems like Blizzard wanted to emphasize the names of the gladiators. And speaking of the two gladiators, let's take a look at their names specifically. Maximus, the gladiator seen on the right side of the poster, is a Latin name which means greatest. However, the reason I'm not focusing on Maximus as being a possible new hero in this video is because the character we see here and his name are more than likely a reference to the 2000 film Gladiator, which is about a fictional Roman gladiator named Maximus. Therefore, as far as I'm concerned, the Maximus we see here is just a fun pop culture reference who fits the Roman theme. However, Zephyrus and his name, by comparison, are a bit more puzzling. While the name Zephyrus and its shortened form, Zephyr, have been used for various things throughout history and pop culture, they all stem from the Greek god Zephyrus, who is the god of the west wind. Now, as far as I can tell, Zephyrus is actually one of the more obscure Greek gods. As someone who only has a passing knowledge of Greek mythology, I'd never even heard of him until I researched the name for this video. And perhaps I'm just horribly ignorant in that regard, but I will note that he's so obscure of a god that he's not even a playable character in Smite, which is definitely saying something about his significance, or lack thereof. Regardless though, as far as I can tell, Zephyrus is a very bizarre choice of name for the character we see here. Not only is he fairly obscure in Greek mythology, but nothing about the god or what he represents is in any way combat-oriented. Outside of accidentally killing one person out of jealousy, none of the myths in which he appears depict him as being violent or any kind of fighter. In fact, he's even regarded as being the gentlest of the four winds, and is seen as being fruitful and a messenger of spring. That definitely doesn't sound like the description of a gladiatorial champion. If this character was just a one-off reference to Greek mythology, then why didn't they name him something more fitting, like Ares or Achilles? Either of those would make far more sense as a gladiatorial combatant, which leads me to believe that Blizzard naming this character Zephyrus was very intentional, and thus could be indicating that there's more to him than just being a name and face on a poster. Now, believe it or not, but this poster and the corresponding social media post aren't the only times we saw Zephyrus' name appear during the Overwatch 2 PvP stream. Its other appearance was actually on a completely different map, being New York. In the Grand Central Station train terminal, multiple posters can be seen advertising the Zephyrus, which in this case appears to be some kind of train. Now, bizarrely enough, the presence of this poster in New York actually makes more sense than the Gladiator in Rome. The Zephyrus train poster seen here is almost certainly a reference to the real-life Zephyr Streamliner train, which was a type of train that ran between American cities during the mid-1900s, and whose name in turn stems from the Greek god Zephyrus. In fact, we can even see the winged god depicted in old Zephyr train logos present as statues within the New York train station. At first glance, these appear to be representing the statue of the god Mercury, which stands atop the real Grand Central Station, but upon further inspection, they seem to more closely resemble the depiction of Zephyrus seen in the Zephyr train logo, especially when it comes to the design of their wings and the position of the arms. So on its own, the Zephyrus seen in New York makes sense as solely being a reference to a historically significant American train. But what doesn't make much sense is the fact that we see this standalone reference appear simultaneously to Rome's Gladiator. And if that wasn't bizarre enough, just like the Gladiator poster, the Zephyrus train poster was retroactively added to New York after BlizzConline. Here is what the poster looked like back during BlizzConline, and here it is as of the PvP livestream. So what this means is that both Rome and New York were retroactively updated following BlizzConline to include posters featuring the name Zephyrus, which is itself an incredibly obscure name stemming from an even more obscure Greek wind god. Yeah, that sure isn't suspicious at all. Now, when it comes to the idea of Zephyrus possibly being a new hero, the train posters on New York specifically give me flashbacks to Baptiste, and how he was seemingly subtly teased on Paris shortly before his release. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this, one of the posters seen on Paris is advertising a real-world opera, which just so happens to have been composed by a man named Jean-Baptiste. At the time of Paris's release, this seemed like just a trivial reference to French history, which is why it came as much surprise when only a couple months later, it was revealed that the next new hero also happened to be named Baptiste, despite having no clear connection to either Paris or the opera. To this day, it remains up for debate whether this was purely a coincidence, or if the Paris opera was in fact hinting at the name of Overwatch's next hero. And that's just one of many times new heroes have been preemptively alluded to. Wrecking Ball was teased on Junkertown well before his release, and Echo's containment pod sat dormant on Route 66 for years before she was ever even revealed as a character. So I'm sure you can see why, given Blizzard's history of subtly teasing future heroes, the appearance of Zephyrus on two completely separate maps is on its own more than a little suspicious. If it only appeared in the New York train station, then we would have no reason to think it's tied to a future hero. But given the bizarrely named Gladiator in Rome, in addition to the New York train posters, both of which were retroactively added to their respective maps following BlizzConline, and the social media post highlighting the Gladiators, things are absolutely looking pretty sus right now. But having now covered all the known appearances thus far of Zephyrus in Overwatch 2, let's talk a little bit about what he might do if he does end up being a future hero. Based on the info we have, there's two things to latch onto when it comes to possible kits and abilities, and those are his name and status as some kind of robot gladiator. Starting with the Gladiator bit, let's jump back to what I mentioned earlier about how the Gladiator robots are likely to be one of three things: colossal mechs, which the pilot controls from within, human-sized robots, which the pilot controls from the sidelines, or virtual fighters who battle within a purely virtual space. Of these three possibilities, the second is the only one which I can realistically see working for a playable Overwatch hero. A Sviatogor-sized mech would just be way too big, and a virtual fighter would be, well, too non-corporeal. Which means if Zephyrus is a hero, he'll likely be the pilot we see here, sitting on the sidelines while controlling the Gladiator robot, which is what's actually engaging in combat. Now, the idea of a robot hero who's controlled by a human on the sidelines actually reminds me of some of the speculation people had for Orisa prior to her release. Back when she was first being teased, people speculated that Ify would in fact be the new hero, and that she'd work by sitting in spawn and remotely controlling a robot who fights alongside the rest of her team. That of course ended up not being how Orisa worked, but I wonder if the community's speculation perhaps gave the developers some ideas for different heroes later down the line. If this is how Zephyrus works as a hero, then it certainly introduces a lot of interesting ideas for his kit and abilities. For one thing, dying might not be as significant, since technically it's only a remotely controlled robot that would be destroyed. Perhaps he could even have some sort of rapid respawn mechanic where he can redeploy a new robot onto the map where the old one died. Interestingly enough, this kind of mechanic was actually something the Overwatch devs originally experimented with when developing Orisa. The idea was for her ultimate to let her respawn via drop pod so that she could more quickly get back into the fight after dying. So perhaps something like that will end up being recycled into the kit of a future hero like Zephyrus. Furthermore, when it comes to Zephyrus' role in Overwatch, the most likely possibility which sticks out to me is that he'll be a tank hero. The armored gladiator design looks like something that'd be fairly tanky, and the disposable nature of him being a remotely controlled robot certainly introduces a number of possibilities when it comes to the idea of him sacrificing himself to protect his team, especially if he does end up having some kind of rapid respawn mechanic. However, there are some notable caveats to this human-controlled robot idea. For one thing, Where exactly will the human pilot be during the match? Will he just sit and spawn while plugged into some kind of computer, or will he just be physically absent entirely? I feel like there'd be a strange sort of disconnect with his character if Zephyrus himself isn't physically present at all during the match. He might make an appearance during victory poses and highlight intros, like what we see with Brigitte's cat and Arisa's dog, but even that just feels like a weird, almost demeaning way of treating the human aspect of his character. I honestly don't have a good solution for how this would work. Maybe in his origin story, we end up seeing that there was an accident and his mind ended up becoming fused to the Gladiator bot he controls, thus making the man and the machine ultimately one and the same. I think it's reaching too far to try and speculate something like that at this point though, so for the time being, I think we'll just have to wait and see how that comes into play, if he does end up being a future hero. The other aspect I want to focus on when it comes to his kid, however, is his name, Zephyrus. As I mentioned earlier, Zephyrus is the Greek god of the west wind, which is likely an indicator of him possessing some kind of wind-based abilities. Outside of multiple heroes possessing the ability of flight, no one on the current roster really fits the wind hero archetype, which means I could easily see a newcomer filling that role. It's tough to say how exactly this would work though with a hero who visually appears to be a Greek gladiator, especially when you factor in the fact that Zephyrus represents the gentlest of the four winds and is also associated with fruitfulness and the coming of spring. Therefore, going by his name alone, I almost want to say that he'd be a support hero, as his Greek god associations definitely sound like things you'd expect from a healer. Which leads me to then wonder if Zephyrus will be some sort of tank support hybrid character. I'm sure me saying that has made many of you shudder and experience horrible flashbacks of Brig 1.0, but with all the fundamental changes being made to hero designs and balance in Overwatch 2, not to mention the shift from 6v6 to 5v5, I can't help but wonder if maybe this kind of hybrid hero is something that'd work better in the sequel than it ever could in Overwatch 1. Once again, I think it's way too early to say for sure at this point, and I'm certainly skeptical of a Gladiator robot being any kind of healer, but you really just have to wonder. And of course, at the end of the day, this is all just speculation. While the appearances of the name Zephyrus and the bizarre context surrounding it in Rome and New York are very suspicious, there's still no guarantee that he'll ever end up being a playable hero. Maybe both the Train and Gladiator are misdirects, with Zephyrus actually alluding to someone or something else entirely that we simply have no way of foreseeing yet. But regardless of what it all ends up being, I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye out for more Zephyrus clues going forward as we slowly approach the release of Overwatch 2. I mean, what's one more candidate on my ever-growing list of suspicious names and faces to keep track of? And speaking of which, I've had a lot of new subscribers join my channel recently, so if you're new here and this is your first time watching one of my new hero analysis videos, be sure to check out some of my other in-depth analyses I've done on heroes like Mauga, the Junker Queen, or one of my recent favorites, the Kanezaka Fox Girl. I'll have a link to the playlist of all these videos down in the description and in the cards on screen, so be sure to check them out. In the meantime though, definitely let me know your thoughts on Zephyrus and whether or not you think he'll end up being a future hero. Do you think he'll be some kind of remotely controlled robot, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments down below, and as always, be sure to subscribe, hit up that bell icon, follow me on Twitter, and come join my Discord server to never miss any future Overwatch 2 news and content. Special thanks to my YouTube channel members who help make these videos possible, and if you'd like to join them to earn some cool rewards like your name at the end of my videos, then just hit that join button down below. This is Master Ian Gamer signing off, and until next time, have a great day.